Same afternoon, I found the spreadsheet that proved my husband's company was already dead. I found the messages that proved he'd been sleeping with our office manager for the better part of a year. Both files were open on the same laptop, his, which he'd left charging on the kitchen island while he went to the gym. I wasn't snooping. I'd gone in to send myself the quarterly numbers because mine had crashed. That's the part nobody believes. I sat there in our kitchen in Aspen Woods with the dishwasher humming and the September light coming low across the counter, and I read both at the same time and I felt almost nothing. Just a cold, clean click, like a deadbolt sliding home. By then, I already knew the company was finished. I was the CFO. I built the finance side of that firm from a card table and a borrowed printer, the same way he'd built the sales side from his charm and his good suits. What I hadn't known until that afternoon was that he'd been spending the last year telling Brielle, our office manager, all the things he used to tell me. That I was the smartest person in any room. That he'd give her the whole world. That she made him feel young. I didn't cry. I closed the laptop, took my own numbers off my phone instead, and started making dinner. Because our daughter would be home from her grandmother's at 6 and she still believed we were a family. He came to me 3 days later, freshly showered, smelling like the cologne I used to buy him, and asked for a divorce. I want to be fair to him about how he did it, because it tells you everything. He sat across from me at that same island and folded his hands and used his closing voice, the one he used on city councilors and bank managers. He said he'd met someone. He said it wasn't about the money, that she wasn't like that she came from nothing and didn't care about any of it. He said I could keep the house. I could keep his shares in the company. I could keep everything. He just wanted his freedom and a clean start. You'd walk away with nothing, I said, not a question. I don't need things, he said. And he actually believed it. I'll rebuild. I always do. I looked at this man I'd been married to for 7 years, the father of my child, and I thought about the spreadsheet, about the $1.4 million CRA reassessment sitting in my inbox that he didn't know the size of, about the P3 contract with the city that had quietly collapsed in August, the one that was supposed to carry us through to spring, about the second mortgage he'd taken on this house to make payroll in June without telling me, which he'd forgotten I would find the moment I pulled the title. He thought he was handing me a kingdom. He was handing me a fire. So I said, okay, if that's really what you want, I won't fight you for any of it. He looked relieved. He'd braced for a war, and I'd handed him a peace treaty, and he never once asked himself why. We agreed to do it through lawyers, an uncontested separation, the whole thing as bloodless as we could make it. In Alberta, you have to live separate and apart for a year before the divorce itself is final. So we set a date for the separation agreement, and he moved his things into boxes that weekend. I watched him pack. He took the good knives, his books, the espresso machine, his half of the wedding china. He left me the company shares and the house and the mortgage I knew about and the one I'd just discovered. And he thought he was being generous. His girlfriend came to help him load the truck. That was the first time I saw her in person off the clock, out of the office, in leggings and a puffer vest, her hair in one of those loose buns that takes an hour to look that easy. She didn't know I'd be home. When she saw him carrying boxes out, she actually said in front of me, "Why are you taking your stuff? Shouldn't she be the one moving out?" He took her aside and murmured something. I caught the shape of it. I told her she could have everything. Trust me, it's a strategy. We'll have so much more later. And I watched her face do the math, the flicker of alarm, the recalculation, and then the softening when he reassured her. And I understood her completely in that 1 second. She wasn't in love. She was invested. There's a difference, and I'd spent a career learning to spot it. When the truck was loaded, he came back in for the last box and stood in the doorway and said, "I'll come for the rest within the month. Don't be difficult about it." I wasn't difficult. I never had to be. The house felt enormous that night. I stood in the front hall, which we'd renovated 2 years ago, the herringbone floor we'd argued about, and I listened to it tick and settle. Then I did the thing that surprised me most. I called the listing agent my friend Heather had recommended, and the next morning, I put the matrimonial home on the market. I didn't tell him. He'd given it to me. What I did with it was no longer his business. His business partner called within the hour of the sign going up. Curtis had been with us since the card table days. A good man. Slow and decent. Are you two actually getting divorced? He asked, like he couldn't make the words fit. We are. He's having some kind of crisis. You know how he gets. Give it 6 months, he'll come crawling back. Curtis sighed down the line. You built half of what he has. Don't throw it away over a fling. I almost laughed. Curtis, of all people, should have known the shares I'd been handed were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he was the only one in that office who still believed in us. I'm not throwing anything away, Curtis, I said. I'm just done holding it up. I want to tell you I felt powerful. I didn't. Not yet. I felt like someone who'd been carrying a piano up a staircase for a decade and had finally set it down. And now my arms wouldn't stop shaking. The thing about being the person who keeps the books is that you know where everybody is buried, because you're the one who dug most of the graves trying to keep everyone fed. I knew the firm had maybe 90 days of runway, and that was being kind. I knew the CRA letter was going to land on his desk eventually, with my husband's name personally on the line because he'd signed director's liability documents back in the early days, smiling, not reading them, while I read every word. I knew that the moment the city's collapse contract became public, the banks would call the loans. None of this was a secret I was hiding from him. It was a fire alarm ringing in a building he was the landlord of. He simply refused to hear it because hearing it would have meant the new life he was building with Brielle was being built on a sinkhole. I had no obligation to keep ringing the bell for a man who decided he didn't need me. The first time I saw them together after he moved out was at the office, of all places, 3 weeks later. I'd gone in on a Saturday to pull files for my lawyer, the records that proved I'd been a co-founder and not just a wife with a title. I came up the stairs, and through the glass, I saw the two of them in his corner office. She was sitting on the edge of his desk, handing him a coffee, and he was looking up at her with an expression I remembered being aimed at me a long time ago before, and then his hand shook. The coffee slapped over the rim and ran across a stack of contracts, and he frowned at his own fingers like they'd betrayed him. I'd noticed the tremor a few times that summer and put it down to caffeine and stress. He drank 4 espressos a day and slept 4 hours a night and had been gnawing antacids like candy since spring. His body had been sending him invoices he kept refusing to pay. She just laughed and dabbed the spill with a napkin and said something that made him smile, and I turned and went down the stairs and got my files some other day. Curtis caught up to me in the parking lot. He's under a lot of pressure, he said, apologizing for a man who hadn't asked him to. It's a phase. Curtis, I said, you don't have to translate him for me anymore. I speak the language fluently. I'm just choosing to stop. The house sold in 9 days. Aspen Woods, good schools, the renovated kitchen. It went almost at asking. I took the offer the same afternoon it came in. Then I did the math I've been avoiding. The part where I paid off both mortgages, the one everybody knew about and the one he'd taken in June to make payroll without telling me, and I watched most of the equity evaporate to cover his secret. What was left was modest, but it was mine, free and clean, and across the bottom of the page where it all netted out there was a number with a plus sign in front of it, and that plus sign was the first thing in months that had made me feel like myself. I bought a 2-bedroom on the river in Bridgeland, close to my office, top floor, light pouring in. I'd had my own RRSPs and my own emergency fund the whole marriage, separate in my name, because the woman who keeps the books never bets her own roof on someone else's optimism. That had been the one fight we never had, because he never asked about my accounts. He assumed everything important flowed through him. It didn't. It never had. He found out about the house from the sign, which had stayed up the 4 days it took to firm up the sale. He called me that night, drunk, his voice loose the way it got after he'd been schmoozing a client. You sold our house, he said. You gave me the house, I said. It's not ours. There's no our anymore. A long silence. Then, smaller, where are you living now? That's not your concern. I want to see you. Can I see you? And then, the thing that almost made me drop the phone, I think I made a mistake with Brielle. I don't think we're right for each other. Can we not do this? I knew that voice. It wasn't love. It was a man who'd built his whole identity on being the one who provides, the one who rescues, and who just discovered that the woman he'd chosen needed rescuing in a way that cost money he no longer had. He hadn't realized he missed me. He'd realized he missed being taken care of, and the new arrangement had it backwards. "You're drunk," I said. "She can't cook," he said. Like that explained everything, and in his world, it did. I had an ulcer flare last week. I needed her to bring me a glass of water and a pill, and she told me I was treating her like a maid. She spends all day shopping. The condo's a disaster. I come home from a 14-hour day and you used to have soup on the stove. You used to know what I needed before I knew. "I'm not your soup read," I said. "And I'm not your nurse, and I'm not your accountant who works for free anymore. You chose her. That's the whole conversation." He went quiet again, and then his voice came back flat and cold, the way it always did when feeling didn't work, and he switched to pride. "Fine, forget I called. I was drunk." And he hung up, and I sat on my new floor in my empty new living room, and I let myself cry, finally. Not for the marriage, but for the 7 years I'd spent being indispensable to a man who only noticed the moment I was gone. The middle stretch is the part of any breaking that nobody warns you about. Not the explosion, the long grinding after, where you keep running into the wreckage in ordinary places. I ran into it at the worst possible time, at my best friend's birthday. Heather had a milestone, the big 4-0, and she'd booked the back room of a steakhouse on 17th. She didn't know the whole story yet. She'd been in Portugal for a month, so when she did the seating, she put me next to my husband out of habit, the way she had at 100 dinners. He showed up. I hadn't expected that. We sat side by side under the warm light while old friends teased us about being the couple who never fights, and I didn't know whether to laugh or be sick. Halfway through the meal, his phone lit up on the table. Brielle's name. He sent it to voicemail. It rang again. The woman across from us said, "Ooh, who's Brielle? Should we be worried?" in that teasing tone, and my husband's face went gray. He stood up and excused himself to take it in the hall, and I could hear the shape of her anger through the door, demanding to know why he hadn't brought her, and his low, tired pleading, "Not now, not here, don't do this." When he came back, he made an excuse and grabbed his coat, and as he reached the door, I said it, clear, level, into a room that had gone quiet. "Don't forget, Tuesday, the lawyer's office, 2 o'clock, to sign." You could have heard a fork drop. He froze with his hand on the door. Then he said, "Right," and he left, and the whole table understood all at once. And Heather's eyes filled up, and she found my hand under the tablecloth and held it. I told her it was fine. It was her birthday. I wasn't going to let a man who didn't matter anymore ruin a room full of people who did. But I left early, and the sympathetic looks followed me out, and I hated those most of all, the pity, because pity assumes you lost. Two things happened in the weeks around the signing that I think about still. The first was the night they brought him into the Foothills emergency on a Saturday, and I got the call because I was still listed as his emergency contact, a detail neither of us had thought to change. Curtis phoned me at 1 in the morning, panicked. Perforated ulcer, the stress and the antacids and the not eating had finally cashed out. I drove down because our daughter's name was on his chart as next of kin to, and I needed to make sure the paperwork was right. And because, God help me, 7 years doesn't evaporate just because you want it to. Brielle was in the waiting room, furious, the way frightened people get when they don't have the tools for fear. When she saw me, she actually stood up and put herself between me and the doors, like I was there to steal him. "Why are you here?" she hissed. "He's not yours anymore." "I'm his emergency contact and the mother of his child," I said. "I'm here for the paperwork. The doctors are doing the rest." I looked at her, this girl who'd wanted my life and was finding out what it actually weighed. "He needs bland food for a few weeks after this. No spice, no coffee, no alcohol, soft things. You'll want to have broth ready when they discharge him." She stared at me like I'd insulted her. "I'm not his cook," she said. And I understood then that he was gonna come home to that apartment and there would be no soup on the stove, and he would lie there in pain, learning the exact dimensions of what he traded away, and none of it was my doing. I told her what he needed. That was the last useful thing I owed either of them. I signed what I had to sign, and I went home and slept better than I had in a year. The second thing happened at a jewelry store. Because the universe has a sense of humor, I was downtown buying Heather a late birthday gift, a pair of earrings I'd seen and saved up the courage to splurge on, and I heard that voice. What a coincidence. Brel, arm through his. They were ring shopping. We weren't even divorced yet, just separated, and they were ring shopping, and she had the gall to ask me to help them pick. You have such good taste. I think she wanted me to break. I think she'd been imagining my face for weeks. I looked at the case. There was a ring in there, 3 carats, a price tag with a number on it that I knew, to the dollar. My husband could not pay, because I knew exactly what was in every account he had access to. That one, I said sweetly, pointing at it. He always said when you love someone, you give them the very best. His face went white. He knew the number too. And then, because his pride has always been louder than his sense, he put his card on the counter and bought it. A ring he could not afford for a woman who would leave him the moment the money ran dry. And the saleswoman beamed. And I felt nothing but a cold, tired pity. And I paid for my earrings and left them to it. He'd promised me a ring like that once, in the card table days. Someday, he'd said. I thought he was dreaming. Turns out he meant it. He just meant it for her. We signed the separation agreement on the Tuesday. He arrived late, gray, thinner, the buttons of his good shirt straining differently than they used to because he'd lost so much weight. He sat down beside me in the lawyer's beige boardroom, and his hand shook when he reached for the pen, and the pen rolled off the table, and I picked it up and handed it to him without a word and without looking at him, because I had decided I was finished looking at him. Do we really have to do this? He said quietly, the pen in his trembling hand. You decided this the day you asked, I said. I'm just finishing the paperwork. He signed. I signed. The lawyer slid the copies across, and the moment my fingers touched mine, I felt that deadbolt slide home one last time, all the way final. Outside on the courthouse steps, no, the lawyer steps, in the bright cold Calgary afternoon with the Chinook Arch over the mountains, he caught up to me. Did you really sell the house? I did. Why? Why? I turned and looked at him then, one last time, really looked. Because your girlfriend's a few $100,000 short on that downtown condo she's been showing you listings for, I said, and the only liquid money you had was tied up in our house, which you gave me. So no, there's nothing left to scrape together. You should ask yourself what she's actually after. The color drained out of him. How do you know about the condo? I'm an accountant, I said. Knowing where the money goes is the entire job. And I walked to my car and drove away, and in the mirror, I watched Brielle climb out of a cab and wedge herself between us and grab his arm, and I watched her face when he told her, and I felt the closest thing to peace I'd had in 2 years. I'd love to tell you the karma was something I engineered, some grand revenge. It wasn't. I just stopped catching things before they hit the floor, and gravity did the rest. The CRA reassessment landed on his desk in November. By then, he didn't have me to negotiate the payment plan, to phone the agent at 8 a.m., and charm and document and stall. The Collapse City contract became public in December, the way those things do, in a small item in the business section that everyone in Calgary's tight little development world reads with their morning coffee. The banks called the loans. By February, the firm he'd built his whole self on was in creditor protection, and his name, the name he loved, the name on the brass plaque he used to touch like a talisman, was in the paper attached to words like insolvency and director liability. Curtis told me most of it in the gentle, apologetic way Curtis tells everything. He'd lost his own savings in it, poor man, and I helped him as much as I could with where to file and who to call, because Curtis had never done anything but believe in people too much. He told me the woman, Brielle, had left in January once the money was visibly gone, that she'd had her eye on someone with a Range Rover and a paid-off house in Springbank. He told me my husband was living in a rented basement suite and that the tremor in his hands had gotten bad enough that people noticed, that he'd nearly fainted at a creditors' meeting. Stress, Curtis said, but I heard the question under it. I felt no triumph. I want that on the record. I'd loved that man once with everything I had, and watching someone you loved demolish himself isn't a victory. It's just sad. But I didn't carry it. I set it down the way I'd set down the piano, and I let myself have my own life back. And my life, it turned out, had been waiting for me the whole time. I'd throw myself into work, into our daughter, into the small, bright apartment on the river. I learned to cook for one and then for two, just me and her, grilled cheese and tomato soup on snow days, pancakes on Sundays. I took her skating on the Bow Lagoon and to the library on Memorial Drive, and I stopped checking my phone at dinner. I got a promotion, then a better offer from a firm I'd respected for years. Forensic accounting, the work I'd always actually wanted to do, the work of finding out where the money really went, which it turns out I'd been training for my entire marriage. There was a man at the new firm, Julian. He'd been a colleague first, a tax lawyer the firm partnered with, quiet and dry and unbearably decent, the kind of man who remembers that your kid had a recital and asks how it went. We'd worked a long fraud file together over the winter, late nights and bad takeout, and somewhere in there I realized I looked forward to the sound of his voice in the hall. He never pushed. He waited until the file closed, and then he asked me, almost shyly, if I'd want to get a coffee sometime that wasn't about work, and I said yes before I'd finished being surprised that I wanted to. The last time I saw my ex-husband was at our daughter's spring recital. He came, which I'll give him credit for. He sat at the back with a cane now because the tremor had a name by then and the name wasn't good, and he looked at me across a gymnasium full of folding chairs with an expression I refused to spend time decoding. After, he stopped me by the door. "You look happy," he said. His voice was weaker than I remembered. "I am." He nodded slowly. "I keep thinking, if I hadn't, if I just, he couldn't finish any of them." "There aren't any ifs," I said, not unkindly. "You made your choices, so did I. I'm not angry at you anymore. I genuinely hope you find your way through this." And I meant it, which is how I knew I was finally free, because forgiveness that costs you nothing isn't forgiveness, and that one cost me nothing at all. He asked, the way the ones who lose always eventually ask, would you have stayed if none of it had happened? I thought about it honestly because he deserved an honest answer, even if he'd never given me one. "Yes," I said. "If you'd been the man I married, I'd have stayed until the very end. I'd have sold everything to fight whatever this is with you. I'd have made the suit." His eyes filled. "But you didn't want that man's life, and you didn't want me, and you can't have the loyalty without the marriage. That's not how it works. That was never how it worked." He bowed his head. Our daughter came running up with her certificate, and I knelt to admire it. And when I stood, he was gathering himself to go, and I said the last thing I'll ever say to him. "Take care of yourself. Eat something soft. And call the CRA back. They'll work with you if you actually answer the phone." Then I took my daughter's hand, and we walked out into the long gold light of a Calgary evening. And the air smelled like cut grass and river and the particular green of spring after a winter that goes on too long. Julian was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his car, holding 3 ice cream cones because he never could resist buying for everyone. My daughter shrieked and ran to him. I walked slower, watching the two of them, the man who showed up with his hands full and the kid who'd learned finally what that looked like. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a woman was to be left for someone younger, someone who promised to take nothing and meant to take everything. I know better now. The worst thing is to spend your whole life being the one who holds it all together for someone who only notices the weight the day you set it down. I set it down. The building fell. I walked out into the light, and I never once looked back to watch it burn, because I already knew exactly how that fire would end. I'd done the math years ago. I just let him be the one to find out. I've had 2 years now to sit with what happened, and the thing I keep coming back to isn't the betrayal, it's the math. Reed handed me everything he owned because he was certain he understood what it was worth, and he was wrong by a margin that ended up costing him his whole life. That's the part people miss when they hear this story. He didn't lose because I plotted against him. He lost because he stopped reading the documents in front of him, stopped listening to the one person who'd been telling him the truth for free, and decided that charm could carry him somewhere only honesty and effort can go. I used to think being a good wife meant catching everything before it hit the floor. Soup on the stove, the CRA letter answered by 8 a.m., the payroll covered, the cracks filled in before anyone saw them. And there's real worth in being that person, in showing up and doing the unglamorous work nobody thanks you for. But I learned the hard way that there's a difference between being dependable and being a doormat, and the line between them is whether the other person ever bothers to see you. Reed never did. He only noticed the weight the day I set it down, and by then it was too late for both of us. What saved me wasn't revenge. I never lifted a finger to hurt him. What saved me was that I'd kept my own accounts in my own name, the whole marriage. That I'd read every contract he'd signed half asleep. That I knew exactly where the money went because that was the work I'd quietly mastered while he was busy being charming. Knowing the truth of your own situation, clearly, without flinching, is its own kind of protection. Nobody can sell you a fantasy when you've already done the arithmetic. And when the floor finally fell out, I didn't fall with it. That took something I didn't know I had until I needed it. The strength to sell the house, to cry on an empty floor and get up the next morning anyway, to take my daughter skating and learn to cook for two, and say yes to a quiet, decent man named Julian when he asked me for a coffee. Walking away whole, when staying broken would have been easier, asked more of me than the marriage ever did. If you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this. Be the person who keeps her word and does the honest work. But never confuse loyalty with letting yourself disappear. Learn your own life well enough that no one can lie to you about it. And when the building comes down, and someday for someone it will, find the nerve to walk out into the light instead of staying to watch it burn. I did the math years ago. I just let him be the one to find out.